Imagine living a life without ever closing your eyes to sleep. Not for one night, not for a week, but for decades. This is the story of a man whose endless nights became one of the strangest mysteries ever recorded. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know. In the lush valleys of Quang Nam province in central Vietnam, the rhythms of life were steady and familiar. Farmers rose with the sun, worked the fields, and rested when darkness settled in. Among them was a man named Thái Ngọc, born around 1942, known affectionately in his community as Thái Ngọc. For most of his early life, he followed the same cycle as his neighbors: labor in the rice fields during the day, a simple meal with family in the evening, and rest when the village fell silent at night. Then came the fever. In the early 1970s, when the scars of war still marked the countryside, Ngọc fell ill with a severe bout of sickness. Accounts consistently describe a high fever that gripped him for days, sometimes even weeks. His body eventually overcame the fever, but when it subsided, something extraordinary and troubling remained. Ngọc discovered that he could no longer sleep. At first, he thought it was temporary. Sleepless nights followed one after another, and he waited for rest to return. But it never did. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and still Ngọc claimed he had not closed his eyes to slumber. According to his recollection, this began in 1973, and from that point onward he lived a life without sleep. Most people would expect the body to collapse, the mind to fracture, if deprived of rest for so long. Yet Ngọc did not falter. Neighbors and visiting reporters noticed something uncanny. He seemed not only alert, but also physically strong. He continued to work his fields, tend to his animals, and carry heavy loads that would exhaust men half his age. He once told interviewers that he could easily shoulder a 50-kilogram sack of fertilizer and walk 4 kilometers without feeling tired. His condition bewildered everyone who heard of it. Doctors had no ready explanation. In ordinary medical understanding, prolonged total insomnia is impossible without severe decline or death. Yet here was a man who appeared to have lived decades without a single night of rest. For Ngọc, however, life had to go on. Since he could not sleep, he simply used the night hours as extra time to work. Neighbors reported that while their homes grew quiet after dark, Ngọc could often be seen outside, clearing land, repairing tools, or tending to crops. Over the decades, he transformed barren hillsides into fertile groves by planting thousands of trees. He dug ponds, cared for animals, and expanded his farm. When asked why he kept working through the night, he would shrug. What else could he do with the long, sleepless hours? As years passed, the story of the man who could not sleep spread beyond his small commune. Journalists came from across Vietnam to witness him firsthand. Some stayed overnight, attempting to see if he would finally succumb to fatigue. Others brought cameras to record him in the hope of catching a moment of drowsiness. Time and again, they left with the same impression. Ngọc remained awake, quietly occupied with his chores. Despite their reports, questions lingered. Could he perhaps drift into microsleeps unnoticed? Was his condition misinterpreted by the limitations of observation? Without rigorous medical monitoring, no definitive answer could be given. What was undeniable, however, was the persistence of his own testimony, the corroborating accounts of his family, and the repeated visits by journalists who all came away telling the same tale. This was a man who had not slept for decades and yet endured. In the quiet hills of Quang Nam, the story of the sleepless farmer spread slowly from his village to the rest of the country. By the middle of the 2000s, reporters began arriving with notebooks, cameras, and skepticism. They wanted to see for themselves whether the man who claimed never to sleep was exaggerating. One evening, a team from a national newspaper stayed in his house. They observed him while the rest of the household retired for the night. As midnight passed, he was still awake, shuffling tools, sweeping the yard, feeding his animals. By dawn, he was still moving about. The reporters, who had fought their own fatigue to watch him, wrote that the man seemed to treat night as simply another span of working hours. He never tried to prove anything. He simply did what he always did, quietly and without complaint. Other newspapers followed. In the years that came, Television crews tried to record him in the hope of catching him asleep. They set up automatic cameras, expecting that eventually exhaustion would take him. But the stories that appeared in print described something different. The cameras died before he did. Batteries drained, film ran out, and still he remained awake, moving in the darkness, walking through his garden or sitting upright. By 2008, the coverage turned to what he had accomplished with his endless nights. Writers noted that while others rested, he planted trees. Night after night, year after year, he carried seedlings to the barren hillsides. With patience and time, he reforested nearly 8 hectares. When villagers awoke in the morning, they would sometimes find new rows of trees standing where the land had been bare the day before. The journalists framed it as a kind of transformation. Sleeplessness that might have been a curse had become an opportunity to give life back to the land. The country's official agencies soon took notice. Photo essays were published showing him digging ponds, tending crops, and carrying heavy loads. He was never depicted at rest. Police press interviewed him in his home, and he gave the same account as always. A fever in the early 1970s, followed by decades of wakefulness. His wife and neighbors supported his story, telling reporters that they had never seen him sleep. These were not fleeting rumors. They were repeated affirmations by people who lived beside him daily. International interest arrived next. A British crew escorted him to a hospital in Da Nang. Doctors placed electrodes on his head and checked his blood. The summaries that appeared in the Vietnamese press said that no serious abnormalities were found, yet no detailed records or peer-reviewed articles were ever published. The doctors admitted that his case was strange but left it there. Later, other newspapers recounted how film crews tried again, watching for nights, waiting for the moment his eyes would finally close. They too left puzzled. As the years passed, journalists returned to check on him. They found him still awake at night, still active on his farm. Some reports added new details. His family noticed that when he drank alcohol, he sometimes seemed to doze lightly, but never for long and never deeply. Even this small concession was not true sleep, they said, more like brief unconsciousness that vanished as quickly as it came. Over nearly 2 decades of reporting, the stories never really changed. Journalists from different outlets, photographers from official agencies, even foreign crews all described the same man, living the same way. He worked by day, he worked by night, and no one could ever point to a time when he slept. The consistency of their accounts gave the story its weight. Though no scientist had ever published a study that could prove the claim, the collective testimony of neighbors, family, and reporters created a portrait that endured. A farmer who simply lived without rest, year after year. The story of Thái Ngọc eventually moved beyond curiosity and human interest right into the realm of official scrutiny. And with that shift came a pattern of gaps, silences, and contradictions that define the way his case has been remembered. On the one hand, there was no shortage of attention. Reporters came in waves, government papers sent their own journalists, television crews from abroad made the journey to Quang Nam. On the other hand, when it came to the kind of scientific documentation that could settle the question once and for all, the record remained frustratingly thin. One of the most notable moments came when foreign documentary filmmakers arranged for Ngọc to be examined at the Da Nang Psychiatric Hospital. Electroencephalography was conducted, blood samples were taken, and doctors attempted to determine whether his brain was entering any form of sleep state undetected. The Vietnamese press wrote about the visit, but the descriptions were brief and non-technical. Doctors were quoted as finding no serious physical abnormalities, but nothing more specific was made available. There were no charts published, no detailed results, and certainly no peer-reviewed paper in a medical journal. For a case that, if proven, would have immense scientific significance, the absence of such documentation was striking. Newspapers also recounted how television crews tried to keep cameras running through the night. They reported that the cameras ran out of power before Ngọc ever closed his eyes. Once again, the observation was compelling but not definitive. A camera that fails after a few hours cannot prove the absence of sleep. It can only record the absence of visible rest during that brief window. In scientific terms, these efforts fell short of controlled monitoring. Yet, in the public eye, they added to the mystique. Even state media, which rarely indulged in sensationalism, stopped short of declaring his condition medically verified. The photo essays and features published by official outlets presented him as a marvel of endurance, but they always relied on journalistic observation and neighbor testimony rather than data. His wife and neighbors affirmed to reporters that he never slept, but no institution issued an official declaration. In that silence, the story was left to grow on its own. Another discrepancy lay in the timeline. Ngọc himself consistently said his sleeplessness began in 1973, following a high fever. Some newspapers repeated 1973 as the origin year, while others wrote 1974 or 1975. The variation is small, but it reflects how the absence of medical records left even basic chronology open to shifting detail. Without hospital documents from the time of his illness, the exact onset could never be independently confirmed. Doctors interviewed in later years sometimes expressed disbelief. In one report, a physician pointed out that absolute insomnia leading to decades of survival contradicts all established medical understanding. In known clinical cases, people deprived of sleep develop hallucinations, physical collapse, or death within days or weeks. To imagine someone enduring for half a century without sleep was almost inconceivable. Yet even as doctors voiced skepticism, they could not dismiss the consistency of the reports from journalists and villagers who had lived alongside Ngọc for decades. His family, too, added nuance. They confirmed his wakefulness but admitted that after drinking rice wine, he would sometimes fall into a shallow, brief doze. To them, it was not true sleep, never the deep rest they saw in others. This small detail raised another unresolved question. Could it be that Ngọc did experience microsleeps or extremely light rest phases that passed unnoticed? Without continuous monitoring, no one could answer. The official record did not resolve the ambiguity. It only underlined it. When journalists pressed him about traveling abroad for study, he reportedly declined. The idea of leaving his village to be examined in a foreign clinic was not appealing to him. He was a farmer attached to his land, his animals, his family. The refusal meant that the kind of detailed, long-term medical observation possible in research hospitals never happened. That decision left the case in a suspended state, endlessly reported, endlessly repeated, but never scientifically closed. The contradictions thus stand at the core of his story. Newspapers described endless wakefulness, but science insisted that such a thing was impossible. Hospital tests were mentioned, but their results were never published in detail. Journalists stayed overnight and saw him awake, but they could not prove that he never drifted into unnoticed moments of rest. International crews filmed him, but their footage was inconclusive. His neighbors swore he never slept, but human observation has limits. At every level, testimony piled up, while definitive evidence remained absent. This tension is what makes the tale endure. On one side is the lived reality of Ngọc and those around him. Decades of nights where he did not lie down, decades of dawns where he rose to work without fatigue. On the other side is the scientific expectation that such a thing cannot be. The official record exists in this uneasy middle ground. His name has appeared in police press, state media, international features, and local journals. His face has been photographed by official news agencies. But in all those pages and all those pictures, there is never the decisive chart or study that would either confirm or disprove the claim beyond doubt. And so the official discrepancies remain as much a part of his legend as the sleeplessness itself. They remind us that Ngọc story is not just about a farmer who could not sleep, but about the limits of observation, the distance between testimony and data, and the spaces where mystery continues even under the light of public scrutiny. His life became a record not only of endurance but of how human stories and official accounts can align in some ways, diverge in others, and never quite meet in the middle. When the story of Thái Ngọc began appearing outside Vietnam, physicians and researchers in other countries inevitably asked how his case compared with what was already known about the limits of human sleeplessness. Medicine has long studied the effects of deprivation, and every controlled experiment has shown that prolonged loss of sleep is catastrophic. Within days, cognitive function collapses. Within weeks, hallucinations and organ damage appear. In extreme cases, fatal outcomes follow. That framework made Knox reported survival through decades without rest, something that seemed to belong outside established science. The most direct comparison is to experiments conducted in the 20th century. In the 1960s, for example, an American student named Randy Gardner voluntarily stayed awake for 11 days under observation. He became disoriented, his mood and memory declined, but he survived and later recovered fully after sleeping. Gardner's case remains one of the longest scientifically documented stretches of wakefulness, yet it ended at less than 2 weeks. To imagine nearly 50 years, as Knox claimed, stretched credibility beyond the bounds of any controlled precedent. There are also rare medical conditions where sleep is profoundly disrupted. Fatal familial insomnia, for example, is a genetic disorder in which patients lose the ability to enter deep sleep. But this illness is progressive and always fatal, usually within months or a few years. Other disorders involve light or fragmented sleep, where a person may feel as though they never slept even though brain scans show brief or shallow stages of rest. Doctors who heard of Knox's case sometimes speculated that he might be experiencing such light or imperceptible sleep, the kind so shallow that he himself, and even observers around him, did not recognize it. Without formal, continuous monitoring, the question could never be settled. International articles about Knox sometimes paired his case with records of so-called long sleepers and short sleepers to emphasize how unusual he appeared. Some people are known to function with 4 or 5 hours a night. Others need 9 or 10. But even at the extremes, all documented cases still involve sleep. What set Knox apart in the accounts was the claim of its total absence. Another comparison lies with cultural stories. Across the world, communities have circulated tales of individuals who did not sleep for years. In many cases, when those individuals were studied more closely, doctors discovered undetected microsleeps or misunderstood symptoms. These parallels caution against assuming absolute sleeplessness without data, but they also show why Knox's story fit into a broader pattern of fascination. People are naturally drawn to tales that push against biological limits. Medical researchers who read about Knox in English translations of Vietnamese reports were left intrigued but unsatisfied. On one hand, the consistency of eyewitness testimony over decades was remarkable. On the other, the absence of published clinical data meant that his case could not be catalogued alongside verified anomalies. He remained, in the eyes of science, an unsolved curiosity rather than a proven phenomenon. What makes his story distinct is the sheer span of time over which it was observed. For nearly half a century, multiple independent newsrooms visited him, and his neighbors lived with the claim daily. Unlike most fleeting cases that vanish after one article, Knox's narrative reappeared in the press again and again. That endurance, combined with the fact that he maintained good health and continued heavy physical labor, made him a living contradiction to the medical literature. By the 2010s, Vietnamese papers themselves began to frame him within this context. Articles did not simply describe his nights awake. They compared him to scientific knowledge, pointing out that his continued vitality went against everything doctors expected. Rather than offering resolution, they highlighted the mystery. He became both a human interest figure and a symbol of the limits of science when confronted with lived experience that did not fit into its categories. His case therefore sits at the crossroads of medicine, folklore, and journalism. Compared to known anomalies, it lacks the technical confirmation that would allow it to stand as a documented exception. But compared to ordinary life, it surpasses anything most people could imagine enduring. That space between what is known and what is observed is where his story continues to live. An unresolved comparison, a man whose life both defied and demanded explanation. As the story of Thái Ngọc spread from village paths to the front pages of national newspapers, it became more than a medical curiosity. It evolved into a cultural symbol within Vietnam, a story that locals retold with equal parts wonder and pride, and a tale that carried a social resonance far beyond the walls of his modest farmhouse. In his commune of K Trung, the initial reaction was one of disbelief. Neighbors who first heard of his sleeplessness thought it was exaggeration, a farmer's tale made longer in the telling. But years passed, and people noticed that he was indeed awake long after others had gone to bed. Some saw him in his fields by moonlight. Others heard the scrape of tools in the dark. Gradually, His condition became a part of the communal landscape. To live near him was to accept that there was a man among them who did not sleep. In rural Vietnam, stories often gain meaning through what they reveal about resilience and perseverance. Farmers endure storms, floods, and the hard labor of the soil. In that cultural frame, Ngoc's sleeplessness was not only strange but also admirable. He was seen as someone who turned misfortune into productivity. While others rested, he planted trees. While the village slumbered, he dug ponds and repaired fences. His neighbors saw the results. The once barren hillsides he had reforested, the ponds he had filled with fish, the steady work that transformed his land. His wakefulness was interpreted less as a curse than as an example of diligence and endurance. When national journalists began to publish stories, the cultural framing deepened. Vietnamese newspapers often balance curiosity with moral undertone, and in writing about Ngoc, they emphasized not just the strangeness of his condition but the way he lived with it. Articles highlighted his productivity, his humility, and his attachment to his land. He did not chase attention, they wrote. He did not seek profit from his condition. Instead, he remained a farmer, tied to his home, content to use his nights for labor rather than spectacle. This portrayal resonated strongly with readers who valued simplicity and perseverance. By the time his story appeared in the official magazine of the Vietnam News Agency, his image was firmly that of a man embodying endurance. The photographs showed him in work clothes, carrying water, tending crops, or standing among the trees he had planted. There was no sense of showmanship, only the quiet presentation of daily life. In this way, his condition was framed as a national curiosity, but also a reflection of rural values: persistence, humility, and the ability to carry on despite hardship. The cultural reception was not limited to admiration. For many, it was also a source of unease. If science declared that no human could live without sleep, then how could they understand the man in K-Trung? The lack of official medical explanation left his neighbors and readers in a state of unresolved wonder. They could not deny the evidence of their own eyes, nor the testimony repeated in newspapers year after year. But they also knew that no one could explain it. That tension became part of the cultural fascination. He was a living mystery, and mysteries in Vietnam often find a home in the cultural imagination, where rational and inexplicable can sit side by side. Socially, his case also touched on themes of trust in observation versus trust in institutions. Villagers trusted what they saw, that he did not sleep. Journalists trusted their nights of waiting, during which they never saw him close his eyes. Yet the medical establishment, bound by data, did not produce an explanation. This gap left many readers feeling that the truth of daily life can sometimes escape official frameworks. In Vietnam, where oral histories and lived experience often carry weight equal to or greater than official documentation, this message resonated deeply. Over the decades, Ngoc himself remained largely indifferent to the attention. He never sought to travel for study, never marketed himself as an attraction. He was content to continue farming. In interviews, he repeated the same origin story without embellishment. The fever in the 1970s, the loss of sleep that never returned. His plain consistency only strengthened the cultural reception. He was not a performer. He was simply a man whose life had taken an extraordinary turn. When younger journalists revisited him in the 2010s and 2020s, they noted how his story had become part of local identity. Children grew up hearing of the sleepless man who planted forests at night. Tourists occasionally asked for directions to his home. For locals, he was both neighbor and legend, someone whose story would outlast him. By then, he was an old man, but still awake in the night, still living in rhythm with the sleeplessness that had defined his life. Internationally, his story was retold in articles and features, often stripped to its most striking detail. A man who had not slept since 1973. In global media, it was often paired with astonishment or incredulity. But within Vietnam, the emphasis was different. He was not framed as a freakish anomaly, but as a man who endured, who used his sleeplessness for work, and who stayed loyal to his land. Thus, the cultural and social reception of Thái Ngoc's story can be understood as a layering of responses. Locally, he was accepted and even admired as a diligent neighbor who made use of his unusual fate. Nationally, he was presented as a human interest figure embodying endurance and humility. Internationally, he became a curiosity in the global imagination. In all these layers, the absence of medical proof did not erase his story. Instead, it gave it more power as a cultural narrative, one that balanced wonder, respect, and mystery in equal measure. When the story of Thái Ngọc crossed borders and appeared in international outlets, it stirred interest not only among casual readers but also among doctors, researchers, and those already working in the field of sleep medicine. At first, the reaction outside Vietnam followed a predictable pattern: fascination, skepticism, and comparison to what was already known about the human body's limits. Over time, however, his story became part of a wider set of case references. Examples of unusual sleep behavior that were discussed in classrooms, online forums, and informal exchanges between scientists. Though no scientific paper was ever written about Ngọc, the endurance of his claim influenced the way many thought about the outer limits of human adaptability. The global medical consensus on sleep is clear and unshaken. Sleep is essential for survival. Studies on animals and humans alike show that without it, systems break down. In carefully monitored experiments, people deprived of sleep for days begin to suffer hallucinations, severe lapses of judgment, and physical deterioration. The longer the deprivation, the more dangerous the outcomes. At the extreme, rare genetic conditions such as fatal familial insomnia prove that complete loss of sleep is incompatible with life. Against this background, the Vietnamese farmer's account seemed to contradict every textbook line. When Ngọc story reached English-language media, especially in the late 2000s and early 2010s, it was often presented with a tone of astonishment. Articles retold the central detail, that he had not slept since 1973, and then quickly compared it with the record of Randy Gardner, who stayed awake for 11 days under observation in 1964. Gardner's experiment, run under medical supervision, was already a benchmark case in sleep research. By setting Ngọc alleged decades of wakefulness beside Gardner's 11 days, writers highlighted the enormity of the claim. For doctors reading these accounts, the contrast was too great to accept at face value. Yet the persistence of the Vietnamese reports kept the story from being dismissed outright. Some specialists speculated, in interviews and conference discussions, that the case might not represent true sleeplessness but rather an extreme form of misperception. In clinical terms, this is sometimes referred to as paradoxical insomnia, where patients believe they are not sleeping even though monitoring shows that they enter shallow stages of rest. It was suggested that Ngọc might have experienced brief microsleeps so light that neither he nor his observers recognized them as sleep. Without EEG data collected over days, however, such suggestions remained hypotheses. Others pointed to cultural differences in the way sleep is recognized and described. In many rural communities, light dozing while sitting upright is not always counted as sleep in the way Western medicine defines it. If Ngọc occasionally nodded off while sitting but never lay down to rest, his family and neighbors might still truthfully insist he did not sleep. This line of reasoning added nuance but did not erase the basic mystery. How could a man of advanced age remain physically strong without ever showing the collapse associated with chronic sleep loss? The lack of formal scientific engagement created its own echo. Sleep researchers often cited his case in passing, not as verified fact, but as an example of an anecdote crying out for study. In doing so, they reinforced the point that the boundaries of science are set not only by what is proven but also by what remains unexplained. For students of medicine reading about Ngọc, the lesson was often about humility, the recognition that human testimony, even when persistent and consistent, is not equivalent to scientific proof, but that it also cannot simply be ignored. Within broader scientific communication, the story played a role similar to that of other extraordinary human interest cases. It circulated widely, provoked questions, and reminded audiences that mysteries persist at the edges of knowledge. In some cases, his story was used in lectures as a counterpoint to discussions of sleep's necessity, as if to say, here is what science shows us, and here is a case that challenges us, even if we cannot verify it. Beyond medicine, the story found its way into social science discussions about the relationship between journalism, folklore, and science. Scholars examining how unusual claims are reported noted that the consistency of Vietnamese press coverage gave his case credibility in the public eye, even though the lack of clinical data prevented it from entering the scientific record. His story was studied as an example of how cultural narratives of endurance and diligence can shape the reception of an anomaly. Among the general public abroad, Ngoc's name often surfaced in online discussions about extreme human records. He was invoked in debates about the Guinness World Records refusal to list categories for longest sleeplessness, precisely because of the dangers involved and the difficulty of verification. People who encountered his story online often treated it as a legend bordering on myth, a human echo of tales about yogis or monks who transcended normal bodily needs. In this way, his story contributed to a wider cultural conversation about the limits of the human condition. Despite the skepticism, it is clear that Ngoc's story left a mark. In medical forums, he was cited as an enduring puzzle. In popular media, he became a symbol of human mystery. In academic commentary, his case was used to illustrate the tension between observation and data. The fact that his story remained unresolved gave it power. It showed that even in an age of science and measurement, some lives escape neat categorization. What makes the influence of his case particularly strong is its longevity. This was not a one-time sensation. Vietnamese newspapers continued to revisit him year after year, and international outlets periodically rediscovered the story. With each retelling, it returned to the attention of new readers, new doctors, new skeptics, and new believers. Each time, it sparked the same question. If sleep is absolutely necessary, then how could this man live without it? The lack of an answer ensured that the question would be asked again and again. In this way, Thái Ngọc influenced scientific and medical discussions abroad not by offering data but by withholding it. His story forced experts to acknowledge the limits of their evidence and to confront the difference between what is known in theory and what is claimed in practice. Whether one believed his account or doubted it, the case became a touchstone. A reminder that science moves not only by confirming what is true but also by explaining what seems impossible. As the decades passed and Thái Ngọc grew older, his story shifted from the immediacy of a strange medical claim into something deeper. It became memory, it became folklore, and it became a media artifact continually reshaped by the societies that retold it. What began as a man's personal struggle with sleeplessness eventually took on the weight of legend, carried in the words of neighbors, the lines of journalists, and the imaginations of readers who encountered him far from his village in Quang Nam. Within his own community, the memory of Ngoc took on the quiet persistence of oral history. Villagers remembered the fever that struck him in the early 1970s. They remembered how he stayed awake long after others had gone to bed. They recalled how his nights were filled with activity, from tending crops to raising animals to walking the fields under starlight. For children growing up in the area, he became part of the lore of the village itself, the sleepless farmer who never closed his eyes, whose energy seemed endless, whose nights were as full as his days. In rural Vietnam, where stories are often shared around meals, markets, and gatherings, his name was passed along as both fact and wonder. Folklore, in the Vietnamese sense, does not always mean invention. It often grows from lived experiences that take on symbolic meaning. In Ngoc's case, his inability to sleep came to symbolize endurance, hard work, and an almost supernatural strength of spirit, though without invoking spirits or mysticism. It was a practical legend, rooted in the soil he tilled and the forests he planted. Neighbors and visitors alike pointed to the physical evidence of his sleepless nights. The hillsides reforested by his hands, the fish ponds dug while others rested. The land itself became a living testimony to the truth of his story, and in this way, memory and folklore merged seamlessly. Media retellings amplified and reshaped this local memory. Vietnamese newspapers in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s revisited him repeatedly, often sending photographers to capture images of the sleepless man at work. Each new article introduced him to a new generation of readers, and each retelling added layers of description. Some emphasized his productivity, others his calm acceptance, and still others his baffling defiance of medical expectation. With time, the repetition of these themes crystallized into a narrative template. The humble farmer who had not slept since 1973, who worked through the nights, and who remained healthy despite everything science said. Internationally, media outlets picked up the story with a slightly different emphasis. Western publications often framed him primarily as a medical enigma, setting his claim against scientific knowledge and presenting him as a man whose life defied explanation. These retellings usually condensed his biography, focusing on the headline fact of decades without sleep and leaving aside the richer cultural context. Yet, even in their brevity, these reports carried his name across continents, embedding him in global curiosity about human extremes. As media turned his life into story, the details became fixed in the public mind. The year 1973, the fever, the sleeplessness, the planting of trees, the tending of livestock, these elements repeated so often that they became canonical, forming a collective memory larger than any single article. Even when discrepancies arose, some reports gave 1974 as the year, others noted occasional dozing after rice wine. The core narrative remained untouched. Readers remembered the essence, not the variations. In collective memory, Ngoc's story also took on symbolic weight beyond the individual. For many Vietnamese readers, he represented the resilience of rural life, the ability to endure hardship, to keep working through the night, to transform adversity into productivity. For international readers, he embodied the allure of mystery, the possibility that the human body might harbor capacities beyond what science had measured. In both contexts, he became more than a man. He became a story that said something about the human condition. Folklore often thrives on repetition across generations, and in this sense, the media played a central role in ensuring that Ngoc's sleeplessness would not be forgotten. Each time a new outlet revisited him, the story was refreshed and retold, woven into the cultural fabric once more. Even after decades, when he had become elderly and frail, journalists still found in him the same enduring question: how can someone live without sleep? The absence of an answer allowed the legend to persist, always renewed by its lack of resolution. It is significant that his story was never sensationalized into myth within Vietnam. Unlike some cultural tales that accumulate supernatural elements, Ngoc's narrative remained rooted in the practical. He was never described as gifted by spirits, never said to have transcended human limits through magic. Instead, he was presented as an ordinary man facing an extraordinary condition. This restraint gave his story a different kind of power. It was not a myth of fantasy but a legend of fact, one that gained strength precisely because it resisted exaggeration. In the collective memory of his village, of the nation, and of global readers, Thái Ngọc thus became three things at once. Locally, he was a neighbor whose sleeplessness was a fact of daily life, recalled in stories shared over years. Nationally, he was a figure of endurance whose tale reflected values of resilience and hard work. Internationally, he was a legend of mystery, circulating in media as a symbol of what science cannot yet explain. Across these layers, his memory was shaped not by what could be proven but by what endured in telling. Even today, when discussions of unusual human conditions arise, his name surfaces in forums, articles, and casual conversations. He has become part of the shared repertoire of strange but true stories that capture the imagination, alongside accounts of extraordinary feats of strength, endurance, or survival. His story lives in memory not because it was fully explained, but because it was not. That lack of closure ensured its survival, weaving him into folklore and embedding him in media archives that continue to circulate his name. The story of Thái Ngọc does not sit only in the realm of medicine or journalism. Over time, it began to intersect with something larger, the timeless questions humans ask about their own endurance, the boundaries of the body, and the meaning of existence when the ordinary rules no longer apply. His sleeplessness became not just a medical curiosity, not just a village legend, but a doorway into reflection about the nature of human resilience, the adaptability of life, and the ways in which unexplained phenomena challenge both science and philosophy. For centuries, sleep has been regarded not just as a biological necessity, but also as a universal human experience. It is the nightly surrender to unconsciousness, the rhythm that defines life's cycle. Philosophers from Aristotle to modern thinkers have pondered sleep as both a mystery and a necessity. To live without it is, in a sense, to live outside of what is normally considered human. This is why Nok's story unsettled so many. It implied that one of the most fundamental shared experiences of humanity might not be as universal as believed. If he truly did not sleep, then what does that mean for our understanding of human limits? On a purely physical level, his endurance seemed to demonstrate extraordinary adaptability. Science tells us that sleep is essential for memory consolidation, cellular repair, and immune function. Yet Nok reportedly continued to farm, to carry heavy loads, to plant trees, and to maintain good health well into old age. Philosophically, this raised questions about whether the human body might harbor compensatory mechanisms that science has not yet discovered. Could it be that his body found another pathway to repair itself? Could his wakefulness be evidence that human beings are more variable than the frameworks of biology currently account for? To many readers, his story carried a deeper symbolic meaning. If ordinary people require rest to survive, then the sleepless farmer embodied the idea of relentless perseverance, the refusal to pause, the constant striving forward. In a country that had endured wars, hardship, and the long struggle of rebuilding, his story resonated as a metaphor for resilience. He became a figure not just of anomaly but of determination, a man whose body refused to stop working just as his nation refused to stop enduring. For philosophers and writers abroad, his story touched on a different theme, the mystery of human limits. Throughout history, accounts of extraordinary individuals, whether monks fasting for years, yogis meditating for weeks without apparent sustenance, or explorers surviving extreme deprivation, have challenged assumptions about what is possible. Nok's sleeplessness entered that lineage. Even if it could not be proven, the persistence of the testimony required people to confront the possibility that there are lives lived outside the boundaries of measurement. This raised philosophical questions about the nature of truth. Is truth only what can be quantified in data, or can it also be what is consistently observed and lived, even if science cannot yet explain it? Another reflection that arose from his case was about the meaning of rest and consciousness. Sleep is not merely a biological process but also a symbolic one. It marks the passage of time, the alternation of day and night, the rhythm of renewal. To live without sleep is, in some sense, to step outside of ordinary time. Nok's life blurred that boundary. For him, there was no division between waking day and resting night. Every hour was usable, every moment continuous. Philosophers might see in this a metaphor for timelessness, an existence unbroken by the cycles that govern most lives. In this sense, his story raised existential questions. What does it mean to live a life without the natural pause that defines human experience? The story also sparked reflections about solitude. Most people share the communal rhythm of sleeping and waking. When the village sleeps, all are at rest together. For Nok, nights were lonely landscapes. He worked while others dreamed. He walked the fields while others lay still. This separation from the communal cycle gave his life a solitary quality. Philosophically, it placed him in a position akin to the watchman or the sentinel, the figure who stays awake while others rest, who bears the burden of sleeplessness for the sake of continuity. His existence evoked the archetype of vigilance, a role that has deep symbolic resonance across cultures. At a broader level, his story also intersected with the philosophy of science itself. The case of a man who lived without sleep posed a challenge. How does science deal with phenomena that cannot be conclusively verified but cannot be dismissed? In philosophy of science, there is a tension between falsifiability and testimony. A claim that cannot be measured cannot be integrated into scientific knowledge, yet when that claim is consistent, persistent, and lived by many witnesses, it also cannot be easily ignored. Nok's case illustrated this tension vividly. It highlighted the limits of scientific inquiry when faced with lives that resist measurement, and it suggested that human experience sometimes outpaces the frameworks designed to capture it. For many readers, especially in Vietnam, his life inspired reflection not on the strangeness of his condition but on its lessons. Here was a man who had been given a burden, the loss of sleep, and who transformed it into productivity and endurance. He did not complain, did not withdraw, did not seek profit from attention. He continued to farm, to plant, to contribute. His story became a moral example, that one can live with hardship without bitterness, that one can turn misfortune into work, that one can endure without surrender. In this way, his life was not just a curiosity but a philosophy in itself, a philosophy of acceptance, diligence, and humility. Internationally, the story sometimes inspired more speculative reflections. Writers and thinkers drew parallels between Nok's sleeplessness and ancient legends of people who transcended ordinary limits. They wondered whether human potential is broader than we know, whether evolution might produce rare individuals with abilities outside the norm. Such reflections were not framed as scientific proof but as philosophical meditation. What does it mean to be human if even something as basic as sleep might not be as fixed as we think? Ultimately, the endurance of his story in the public imagination reflects its philosophical richness. It was not only the impossibility of sleeplessness that captivated people, but also what that impossibility symbolized. Resilience, solitude, vigilance, mystery, and the confrontation between science and lived reality. The sleepless farmer became a mirror in which people saw not only a medical anomaly but also their own questions about endurance, truth, and the meaning of life. As the years moved forward and Thái Ngọc aged into the final decades of his life, the shape of his story subtly changed. In the early years, his sleeplessness was a headline curiosity, a medical riddle that journalists rushed to describe. In middle age, it became a symbol of endurance and diligence, woven into the narrative of his country's resilience and his community's admiration. In old age, however, his condition was no longer just about what was happening to him in the present. It became about what he had already lived, what his life represented, and how it would be remembered when he was gone. In the village of Trung, he lived out his later years much as he always had, tending to his land, maintaining the fish ponds he had dug, watching over the groves of trees he had planted decades earlier during his countless sleepless nights. Neighbors remarked that his energy seemed undiminished even as age crept upon him. They saw him carrying heavy loads, working in fields, or moving with the same deliberate pace he had always kept. For them, the sleepless man had become part of the natural landscape, his presence taken for granted in the rhythms of village life. Journalists who revisited him in those years often remarked on his modesty and the constancy of his story. When asked about his sleeplessness, he always gave the same explanation without embellishment. It began after a fever in the early 1970s, and from that point onward, he could not sleep. He did not attempt to theorize or dramatize. His refusal to change his story over decades gave it a stability that made even skeptics pause. He was not seeking fame. He was simply recounting what he lived. His late life years also deepened the symbolic weight of his condition. In Vietnamese culture, age is associated with wisdom, with the accumulation of life experience. An old man who had spent nearly 50 years awake was no longer just a medical puzzle. He was a living archive of memory, a witness who had watched more nights pass than any other man alive. Villagers and journalists alike sometimes reflected on the strange intimacy he must have had with time itself. While others had slept through half their lives, Ngọc had lived through every hour, present for every tick of the clock, every rising of the moon, every breaking of the dawn. This gave his legacy an almost philosophical aura. He was the man who had lived more hours of waking life than anyone else. As he grew older, his story spread further through the internet. Global news outlets, blogs, and forums picked up his tale, sometimes simplifying it into a striking headline: "The man who hasn't slept since 1973. These retellings often stripped away the nuance, presenting him as a medical marvel without the cultural context. But even in that simplified form, his name reached audiences in distant countries. People debated him in online communities devoted to strange human records, medical anomalies, and endurance stories. He became part of a global folklore of the digital age, a story endlessly shared, copied, and reimagined. In Vietnam, however, the retellings kept their cultural grounding. When official outlets revisited him, they continued to frame his story around values of diligence and humility. They photographed him at work, described his contributions to his land, and emphasized his refusal to commercialize his condition. Unlike some figures who become spectacles, Ngọc remained firmly rooted in the image of the ordinary farmer. His legacy was not of a man who sought attention, but of a man who simply lived his fate. When the subject of his health arose in later years, accounts noted small details that complicated the legend. Some villagers and family members observed that after drinking rice wine, he might briefly close his eyes. Some journalists suggested he might have experienced moments of microsleep or shallow rest that passed unnoticed. Yet these details did little to change the broader cultural memory. For those who had lived alongside him for decades, the essential fact remained unchanged. He was the man who did not sleep. By the time of his passing, though the exact year is not clearly documented in all sources, his legend had already secured its place in collective memory. Local villagers remembered him with respect. National newspapers revisited his story in obituaries and retrospective features, presenting him as one of the most unusual figures of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Internationally, his name continued to appear in articles about medical mysteries, long after his life had ended. His legacy also inspired reflection on the human relationship with time. For most people, nearly 1/3 of life is spent in sleep. To imagine a man who bypassed that portion entirely is to imagine a life lived in expanded hours. Whether or not Ngọc truly experienced zero sleep, the narrative of his sleeplessness forced people to think differently about how life is measured. His nights of labor, planting, digging, building, left physical traces in the land that became his living monument. Every tree that grew on his hillside, every fish pond that filled with water, testified to hours spent awake when others were dreaming. In this sense, his legacy was written into the landscape itself. In death, as in life, the question of proof remained unresolved. No definitive scientific study had been conducted, no medical paper had confirmed or denied his claim. But the lack of closure only amplified his story's endurance. His memory lived on in a paradoxical state. Half fact, half legend, impossible to prove yet impossible to forget. That unresolved quality became part of his posthumous legacy, ensuring that his name would continue to surface whenever people asked how far human endurance could go. Today, when his story is recalled in Vietnam, it carries both pride and curiosity. Pride in the figure of a farmer who endured hardship without complaint, who used his sleeplessness for work rather than despair. Curiosity in the unsolved mystery of how such a life was possible. Internationally, his name remains a shorthand for the inexplicable, a man invoked in discussions of sleep, endurance, and the strange margins of human possibility. In the end, the late-life legacy of Thái Ngọc can be summarized not by what was proven but by what was lived and remembered. He became a legend not because science explained him but because it could not. He left behind not only the story of a sleepless man but also the forests he planted, the ponds he dug, and the enduring lesson of resilience. In memory, he remains the farmer who never slept, a figure whose story continues to echo in villages, in newspapers, and in the imaginations of those who wonder where the boundaries of human life truly lie. In the years following his rise to international attention, Thái Ngọc story began to acquire a second life, not just as a human interest report or a cultural legend, but as an educational and professional reference point. Teachers, journalists, and even scientists often used his case as an example, not because it provided clear answers, but because it illustrated powerful lessons about the limits of knowledge, the responsibilities of reporting, and the tension between anecdote and evidence. In classrooms in Vietnam, particularly in literature and journalism studies, his story was sometimes invoked as a lesson in narrative power. Students were taught how a simple, consistent account, a man who has not slept since 1973, can be repeated across generations of media and retain its grip on public imagination. Professors of journalism used him as a case study in the ethics of reporting extraordinary claims. Should a journalist repeat what neighbors and family said if there was no clinical proof? Should they emphasize the mystery, or should they emphasize the absence of scientific confirmation? In this way, Ngọc story became more than just a tale about sleeplessness. It became a teaching tool about the craft of journalism itself. Medical educators abroad sometimes referenced him in lectures on sleep disorders and sleep necessity. For students, the sleepless farmer of Vietnam represented a paradox that could open discussion. Professors would say, "Here is what we know about sleep's role in survival, and here is a story that challenges it." How do we respond? The goal was not to validate his case as proven fact, but to highlight the importance of skepticism, critical thinking, and the need for verifiable data. By raising Knox's name, educators illustrated the difference between anecdote and experiment, between testimony and measurable evidence. Science communicators, those who explain complex topics to the general public, found his story especially useful. In articles and lectures about pseudoscience, folklore, or unverified claims, his case stood as a perfect example of how stories spread when they are repeated often enough and contain a compelling human element. Unlike urban legends invented wholesale, Knox's account was grounded in real journalism, photographs, and consistent testimony. That authenticity made it harder to dismiss outright, and thus it provided a nuanced case for discussion. What do we do with stories that cannot be verified but also refuse to disappear? Within journalism itself, his story was studied as an example of long-form narrative longevity. Most human interest stories disappear after a week or two, but Knox was revisited repeatedly over decades. Editors and reporters asked why. The answer lay partly in the universality of sleep. Every human being understands the need to rest, and so every reader could immediately grasp the enormity of a man who supposedly did not. His story also fit into the classic journalistic triad of man versus nature, man versus body, man versus mystery. It was the kind of tale that never lost its appeal because it spoke to something everyone could understand and question. At the same time, Knox's case forced journalists to reflect on their responsibility to frame stories carefully. Early reports often emphasized the extraordinary claim without balancing it against the scientific impossibility. Later accounts became more cautious, highlighting the fact that doctors had not confirmed his condition, and sometimes speculating about alternative explanations such as microsleep. This evolution in coverage is itself part of his legacy. He taught the media, by example, the importance of careful framing when dealing with anomalies. In international discussions of record-keeping, particularly around Guinness World Records, his case also appeared indirectly. Guinness famously declined to maintain categories for longest periods without sleep, citing health dangers and unverifiable claims. Knox's story reinforced that policy. If someone could claim to have not slept for decades, how could such records ever be fairly judged? The case reminded organizations that when human health is at stake, some competitions should not be encouraged. Another way his story influenced education and communication was through the theme of critical thinking. In textbooks, seminars, and even popular science blogs, he was used as a thought experiment. The question posed was often, if someone insists they have not slept for decades, and dozens of journalists and villagers confirm it, what weight should we give that testimony? This question led to lessons about the reliability of human memory, the fallibility of observation, and the necessity of objective measurement. In this way, his life was not just a story but a challenge, an ongoing problem posed to students and readers alike. For the Vietnamese public, Knox's story also carried lessons about humility before the unexplained. The coverage never turned into mockery, never dismissed him as a hoax. Instead, it framed him as a man living his life, productive and dignified despite a condition that no one could explain. That respectful framing became an example of how journalism can treat unusual subjects with empathy rather than exploitation. His dignity remained intact because the tone of coverage emphasized his humanity over the sensationalism of his anomaly. In the global arena of science communication, Knox became one of many unsolved human cases used to illustrate how medical science progresses. Communicators pointed out that such stories should inspire investigation, but also caution against premature conclusions. By comparing his case with others, from yogis said to survive without food for weeks to patients with rare genetic sleep disorders, they taught audiences about the importance of evidence and the boundaries of anecdote. Knox's endurance was real in the social and cultural record, but whether it was real in the medical sense could never be known. That distinction became a key educational takeaway. Thus, in his later years and beyond, Knox's story entered a new phase of life, not just lived, not just told, but taught. He became a tool for reflection in classrooms, a benchmark in journalism ethics, a case in science communication, and a reminder of the fine line between mystery and myth. His life, therefore, extended beyond his village and his land. It entered the broader fields of education and media as a living lesson in how humanity grapples with the unknown. Across history and cultures, human beings have always been fascinated by stories of those who seem to stand at the edge of human possibility, figures whose lives appear to defy natural limits. Some of these stories are rooted in religion and spirituality, some in survival against impossible odds, and others in unexplained biological anomalies. Over time, Thái Ngọc life came to sit quietly within this vast tradition, not as a mythical hero, but as one more example of humanity's enduring fascination with the extraordinary. Long before his sleepless nights drew attention, legends were told of yogis in India who could meditate for weeks without food, of monks in Tibet who withstood freezing mountains without clothing, and of Christian mystics who lived for years on little more than bread and water. These figures were often interpreted not just as physical anomalies, but as spiritual examples, their endurance linked to inner strength, divine blessing, or transcendence of ordinary needs. Ngọc story was never framed in overtly spiritual terms, yet in the imagination of many, it carried a similar resonance. A man living outside of nature's rules, surviving where others could not. In the modern era, stories of endurance have often taken more scientific or journalistic form. There are the tales of prisoners of war surviving starvation rations, of mountaineers enduring thin air at impossible altitudes, of shipwrecked sailors lasting weeks at sea. Each such story raises questions about where human limits truly lie. Ngọc case stood apart because it was not a tale of temporary endurance but of a life sustained for decades without one of the body's most basic requirements. While survival tales often measure endurance in weeks, his was measured in years, then decades, creating a scale unmatched by most accounts. He also fit within the category of medical marvels that the press has long chronicled, individuals with rare conditions that defy easy explanation. Stories circulate of children who feel no pain, of people with immunity to diseases, of elders who live past 110. Like those figures, Ngọc was both celebrated and questioned, admired for his resilience but scrutinized for the gaps in evidence. His story resonated internationally because it occupied that same paradoxical space. Real enough to be retold, mysterious enough never to be resolved. In the broader tapestry of endurance legends, Ngọc life carried distinctive themes. Unlike the mystics or survivalists who endured extreme conditions for a cause, faith, exploration, or war, his endurance was unchosen. He did not seek to prove anything, did not pursue a record, did not frame his sleeplessness as a sign of power. Simply happened and he adapted. That quiet acceptance made his story different from others. Where survivalists are praised for courage and mystics for holiness, Ngọc was respected for perseverance and humility. He embodied endurance without spectacle. Global audiences often compared him, consciously or unconsciously, to figures like Randy Gardner, the American student who stayed awake for 11 days in 1964 under scientific observation, or Tony Wright, who claimed to have gone longer without sleep in the 2000s. Those cases, though impressive, remained finite experiments. Ngọc story, if true, dwarfed them in scale. For readers, the contrast emphasized the uniqueness of his claim. Others strained to endure a week without sleep, while he lived decades. This made his story both awe-inspiring and implausible, ensuring it circulated endlessly in the realm between fact and legend. Another way his story fits into global endurance lore is through the theme of watchfulness. Many cultures carry archetypes of the sentinel, the guardian who does not rest while others sleep. Soldiers, shepherds, and spiritual watchmen all embody this idea of vigilance. Ngọc, by fate rather than choice, lived that role. Night after night, while his village rested, he was awake, tending his land or keeping watch. In that sense, he echoed an ancient human archetype, the one who stays awake so that others may dream. The endurance legends of the world also highlight a universal truth. Humanity is drawn not just to what is explainable, but to what resists explanation. Stories of people who live beyond limits give us a sense that life is larger than science has yet mapped. They allow cultures to dream of possibilities, to imagine resilience in the face of impossible trials. Ngọc story, like those of the fasting mystics or the pain-free children, fulfilled this role. Whether fully believed or not, it opened space for wonder, and that wonder itself was valuable. For Vietnam, his placement in this global tradition carried added meaning. In a nation marked by centuries of hardship, colonial struggles, wars, and rebuilding, his sleepless life became one more example of resilience. Just as other cultures elevated figures who endured for faith or exploration, Vietnam could point to a humble farmer who endured simply because he had no choice, and in doing so, he continued to contribute, work, and live with dignity. Thus, in the global catalog of endurance legends, Thái Ngọc stands as both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because he did not seek greatness, did not step onto a stage, did not demand recognition. Extraordinary because his life, as reported and remembered, stretched the very boundaries of what humans believe is possible. He became part of a larger human tradition, the endless fascination with those rare individuals who live at the edge of endurance, whose stories blur the line between fact and myth, and whose lives, whether fully explainable or not, remind us of the deep mysteries that still linger at the heart of human existence. In the end, the story of Thái Ngọc does not conclude with certainty, but with ambiguity. Unlike the medical experiments that end with data points, or the survival stories that end with rescue or death, his tale lives on in the space between belief and doubt. That unresolved nature is precisely what has given it such durability. It has become less about one man's condition and more about the questions it forces humanity to ask, about the limits of science, the power of folklore, and the ways in which memory preserves the unexplained. From the standpoint of science, Ngọc story remains impossible. The consensus of modern medicine is clear. No human can survive indefinitely without sleep. Controlled deprivation studies consistently show decline in cognition, mood, and immune function after only a few days. Death is the expected outcome within weeks if sleep is truly absent. That evidence stands like an immovable wall. Yet Ngọc life, as told by him, his neighbors, and journalists, seemed to slip past that wall. He lived decades, worked daily, and aged into his 70s. This contradiction, between the immovable wall of medical knowledge and the unstoppable persistence of his testimony, forms the heart of the mystery. For skeptics, the explanation lies in the gaps. Perhaps Ngọc experienced microsleeps so brief that he did not recognize them. Perhaps his definition of sleep was different from the clinical one. He may have rested in semi-conscious states, mistaking them for wakefulness. Perhaps, too, the journalists were caught in the momentum of a good story, repeating the claim without pressing for hard proof. These possibilities are reasonable, but they cannot erase the consistency of his account. For nearly half a century, he never wavered in his story. For his neighbors, who saw him at all hours, the claim seemed real. That combination of persistence and testimony keeps the mystery alive. For believers, the story suggests that human beings are not as uniform as science assumes. Perhaps there are outliers, rare individuals whose bodies adapt in ways not yet understood. Just as some people survive extreme cold or heat, or endure diseases that kill others, perhaps one man's biology found a way to function without traditional sleep. Even if science cannot confirm it, the very possibility sparks imagination. Ngọc life becomes a reminder that human knowledge is still incomplete, that there may be rare exceptions hidden in the vastness of human variation. Beyond the realm of science, the mystery takes on cultural weight. Folklore thrives not on certainty, but on the tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Ngọc story contains all the ingredients of a living legend. A humble farmer, a simple life disrupted by an unexplainable condition, decades of testimony, and a refusal of final resolution. Unlike myths of gods or spirits, his tale is grounded in reality, but like those myths, it resists final explanation. That makes it a perfect story to be told, retold, and remembered, each retelling carrying a mixture of fact and wonder. The persistence of his story also illustrates the nature of memory. In his village, memories of Ngọc became part of local identity. To outsiders, K Trung was not just another farming community, but the place where the sleepless farmer lived. That association gave the village a kind of mythic identity, rooted in a real person. On the internet, meanwhile, his story became part of digital folklore. Shared in forums, repeated in news lists of unsolved mysteries, it entered the endless cycle of modern storytelling, where fact and legend intermingle without resolution. In both contexts, the lack of proof was not a weakness but a strength. It made the story endlessly discussable. Philosophically, the unresolved nature of his case forces reflection on the relationship between knowledge and humility. Science seeks certainty, but human life is full of uncertainties. Knox's story shows how the unknown persists, reminding us that the world is larger than our frameworks. It teaches that while skepticism is necessary, so too is the capacity to live with unanswered questions. His life becomes a parable not of proof, but of mystery itself, of how humans continue to find meaning in what cannot be fully explained. In that sense, Knox's legacy is not simply that of a sleepless man. It is that of a story that teaches. It teaches journalists about responsibility, scientists about the importance of evidence, philosophers about the endurance of mystery, and ordinary people about resilience. His sleepless nights became more than personal hardship. They became hours transformed into work, into trees planted, into ponds dug, into legends told. That transformation is itself a lesson in how humans turn the inexplicable into meaning. As time passes, his story will likely remain unresolved. No final study will appear, no decisive proof will settle the debate. But perhaps that is as it should be. Not every life exists to provide answers. Some lives exist to provide questions, to remind humanity of the limits of certainty, to open the imagination to the possibility that there are still mysteries in the world. Thái Ngọc life, lived without sleep and remembered without resolution, is one such life. As the story of Thái Ngọc settled into history, it did not fade into silence. Instead, it continued to ripple outward, finding new relevance in a modern world where sleeplessness itself has become a defining feature of life. His condition may have been extraordinary, even anomalous, but the questions it raised resonate deeply with societies now struggling with insomnia, overwork, and the relentless pace of modern productivity. In this way, his life, though rooted in the soil of a small Vietnamese village, speaks powerfully to global concerns of the present age. In today's world, sleeplessness is no longer a mystery, it is a crisis. Across nations, millions suffer from chronic insomnia, from the effects of night shift labor, from the glow of digital screens that extend waking hours. Unlike Ngọc, who endured without apparent decline, most of these people suffer physically and mentally from their lack of rest. Doctors warn of stress, burnout, heart disease, and depression. In this modern context, his story takes on a double edge. It inspires wonder, but it also underscores how fragile most humans are when deprived of sleep. He stands as a counterpoint to the suffering of millions, a reminder of how unusual his endurance truly was. At the same time, his story resonates with the culture of overwork that defines much of the modern economy. In cities around the world, workers boast of surviving on 4 hours of sleep, students pride themselves on all-nighters, and corporate cultures reward constant availability. The sleepless farmer of Vietnam is sometimes invoked in these contexts, not as a model to emulate, but as a symbolic extreme. He embodies what it would mean to live in a world where sleep had no hold, a world of unbroken productivity, but also of unbroken solitude. His life prompts reflection. Even if one could live without sleep, would that be desirable? What is lost when dreams vanish, when rest disappears, when night becomes only another working day? In this way, his legacy is not merely medical or folkloric, it is also philosophical and cultural. He becomes a mirror held up to the modern condition, forcing people to think about the value of rest, the role of limits, and the need for balance. For all his endurance, Ngọc life was marked by a strange isolation, awake while others slept, living in a rhythm apart from community. Modern society, in its chase for endless productivity, risks a similar fate, being awake always, but also being alone in that wakefulness. His story, unintentionally, serves as a cautionary parable for a sleepless age. The unresolved nature of his case also finds new life in an era obsessed with data and proof. In a world where everything is measured, heart rates tracked by watches, sleep cycles graphed by apps, productivity timed by software, his story reminds us that not all truths fit neatly into metrics. Some truths remain lived, not quantified. His life challenges the modern faith that everything can be captured in numbers. It suggests that even in an age of science and surveillance, there are still mysteries that escape capture, still stories that live on the strength of human memory and testimony. In Vietnam, his legacy endures most vividly in his village and in national memory. For the villagers of K Trung, he remains part of their identity, a story that connects their community to the wider world. For the nation, he symbolizes resilience, the ability to endure hardship with humility and without complaint. For the global audience, he remains a legend of the unexplained, a name that surfaces whenever people speak of the limits of sleep and human survival. Each of these layers ensures that his story will not be forgotten, even as decades pass. And so, the story of Thái Ngọc ends not with proof, not with resolution, but with resonance. He lived a life that defied the ordinary, and in doing so, he entered the realm of legend. He taught science humility, taught journalism caution, taught his neighbors perseverance, and taught the wider world the power of mystery. His sleepless nights gave rise to forests, ponds, and legends, lasting contributions that outlive the questions about how he endured. The final lesson of his life may be this: that human beings do not live by answers alone. They live also by stories, stories that inspire, unsettle, and remind them of the vast unknown. Thái Ngọc sleepless decades were one such story. He was a farmer, a neighbor, a husband, a man who carried his fate without complaint. And he was also something more. A figure who blurred the line between fact and myth, who showed the endurance of the human spirit, and who left behind a mystery that will never truly be solved. Thus ends his tale, not with closure, but with continuity, not with certainty, but with the enduring echo of wonder. For as long as people ask how far human beings can go, the story of the sleepless farmer will be remembered, retold, and reimagined. It is, and will remain, a legend at the edge of possibility. And so, the sleepless farmer's story ends not with answers, but with wonder, a mystery that lingers in the night. If you enjoyed this journey and want to explore more untold stories from the edges of possibility, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me here on Eternal Obsidian, where the mysteries never sleep.